Welcome to the Heartbeat Podcast with your host, Mike Sommer, where CIOs get what they won't hear anywhere else. Candid insights, real strategies, and the truth about leading tech in a world that's changing faster than ever.
Today's guest brings over 3 decades of IT and business leadership to the table. Karl Mosgofian is a seasoned technology executive with deep experience across the IT spectrum. From enterprise applications and infrastructure to architecture, cybersecurity, and business process optimization. He's led high-impact teams ranging from 20 to 200 across both large-scale enterprise and nimble organizations, always with a focus on operational excellence and strategic transformation. Whether it's aligning IT with business goals or future-proofing technology stacks, he brings a pragmatic, results-driven approach that today's CIOs will appreciate. So thank you so much, Karl, for joining.
Thanks. It's fun to be here. Love talking about this stuff. Get a bunch of CIOs together at a lunch or dinner or something, and they'll talk about work. We love it. We can't get enough of it. I don't know quite what that is, but I'm always happy to talk and share and network and help us all grow as a CIO community.
You've recently transitioned from being a full-time CIO to a strategic advisor or a fractional CIO. So what has motivated this shift, and how has the adjustment been so far?
Yeah, I'm just like barely 3 months into it. Part of the answer is come back and talk to me in a year and see how I'm doing. And who knows, I might have gone back to a real job. But right now in my life, I just really wanted to shift to more of a part-time working life and have room for some other things. I was mentioning that I did an unusual thing this week, which was I attended a conference, which was not a tech conference, but a trails conference. Okay. Because one of the other hats that I have is running a volunteer organization that does hiking trail building and maintenance of those trails. I wanted to have more time for some other things in my life, and I was in a position to be able to make that choice, which I'm fortunate to be in that position. So I'm giving it a try, and so far having a great time and finding a lot of smaller companies that aren't big enough to have a full-time CIO are really hungry for some advice, for some strategy, for some input from someone like me. So far I'm having fun. As long as I'm working with good people and feel like I'm adding value, it's all good. I'll worry less about exactly how much money I'm making or what my fancy title is or something like that. I'm more interested in just the guts of what I'm actually doing.
Fantastic. So looking back over your 10 plus years as a CIO, what would you say were some of your biggest personal growth moments?
I think, to be honest, while we grow in any challenge, whether it's a good challenge or a bad challenge, oftentimes the bad times are actually where we learn the most. But you learn something in either case, right? I think the only scenario that's bad is being stagnant. And if you're stagnant for too long, then you're not learning that much. So I think that at the moments where we've had big economic downturns, I had to downsize my team, I had to figure out how to organize things differently. Those have been really tough to go through, but I think you also learn some things from that are really helpful, even when times are not bad, right? You build this muscle around efficiency, organization structure, doing things the right way, hopefully so that you don't get into a situation where you then have to make a big cut or something. At Gainsight, I also had a kind of a fun growth opportunity, which was I joined Gainsight about 7 years ago, and we had tremendous growth. So the size of the company was growing, our revenue was growing, and that's a problem too, but it's a more fun problem. But it brings its own challenges, and you learn things about how to grow quickly, how to support rapid growth in a company, and those were good lessons too.
So if we can just dig in a little bit, at Gainsight, you helped the company scale significantly. What were the critical inflection points where IT had to fundamentally rethink its approach to meeting business needs?
I think probably as a born in the cloud company, probably more on the application side than the infrastructure. A different kind of company might have had an inflection point around their internal network or something. For us, the challenges I think were more around the enterprise applications. And we had an experience that I think is probably common to a lot of startups as they scale and they move from being startup to being actually a pretty mature company, which is you start with a lot of very basic internal applications. You didn't have an IT department. It was probably implemented by a business group, but you outgrow them, right? And you outgrow not just the applications, but the processes. And in fact, one thing I really saw very clearly at Gainsight was it isn't just that we grew in number of people or in revenue, we grew in complexity, right? For instance, we bought companies in different parts of the world. So now we had international expansion. We changed our business models. We grew the number of products that we had and how we packaged them. I think sometimes people can use revenue size or number of people as a proxy for the complexity of a company, but really it's the complexity that drives IT challenges. And it's where the business needs us the most, because the processes are getting more complicated, the data is getting more complicated. And so those early systems that people put in that may have been fine in the beginning, they stop working so well. And everyone has this experience where you hit the wall and you're like, okay, we're going to have to actually go buy a more expensive, more complicated platform. We're going to have to implement it. We're going to have to migrate to it. We're going to have to do change management, but we simply can't put it off anymore. And to be honest, I think most companies will put it off until they can't, because it's no fun. And it's not what anyone wants to spend their money on. Companies would always rather invest in go-to-market and in sales and marketing. Like, how do we sell more stuff? Growing revenue is more fun than managing costs. But it's not just costs, right? When processes and systems don't match the reality of the business, then now you start to lose agility. Now you start to lose customer satisfaction, right? Customers are like, I hate doing business with you because I can't just get this order pushed through, or I ordered this thing and you haven't provisioned it. What's going on? When you're not doing things well from a process and system standpoint, you have to hire an army of people as you scale. You have to scale your people in a linear way with your revenue, but that's not how you build a successful business. But even aside from the financial impact of it, I've actually come to feel like the agility piece is almost just as important. Because when the business says, listen, we want to pivot, we need to have a different business model. And the answer that comes back from the operational side of the business is, that's great, we can't do that. We need 6 months to go do that. That's a big problem. Now you're really impacting the business in a way that's really serious. And so I think those have been the moments when IT has been able to add the most, is when it's been supporting not just growth in size, so to speak, but growth in complexity.
If I can paint a scenario and then maybe ask how you would approach it, as it's something I'm seeing oftentimes in the market. Salesforce, being the 800-pound gorilla in today's world, is still positioning itself as incredibly agile. What I'm seeing a lot of times, especially for what I'll call the mid-market, so businesses that have between 250 to 5,000 employees, where most of the growth happens in this country, may have purchased Salesforce. So they purchased a technology that was enterprise ready, but they built it and designed it in such a way that met their needs when they're smaller. They grew over time and accumulated a lot of technology debt processes, and sometimes it was put together with a bit of duct tape and baling wire. They reach a point where I would call them late stage startups. So they're getting cash flow velocity, the business is running well, but the technology stack they built now is reaching a point where it can't scale. So they've hit what I call a tipping point. And that tipping point is really where they're at. And on the other side of this giant gorge is the scaling side of enterprise. So there's this valley that they need to traverse, or they need to cross over it somehow. From your perspective as a CIO, where do you go to for help, or how do you address that concern, which is you have the right technology, but maybe it's implemented, it's governed, it's funded, all those issues are significantly lacking for your future?
Yeah, that's a really tough problem. And I've faced it multiple times. And honestly, I feel like everybody has that issue. In some ways, it's easier. I was talking about moving from your early applications to more enterprise applications. But you're right, with Salesforce, typically what happens is people started with Salesforce, but the problem is the implementation was an early stage implementation, and now you actually need an enterprise implementation. And it's really harder to sell that in some ways, I think, internally in the company, to say, hey, we need to go spend a significant amount of money to solve this problem. And it's funny, I think sometimes it's easier for people to do that in the context of, hey, we're going to buy this new product, because then there's a sense that this product is going to solve a lot of problems. And oh, by the way, we need to spend money and implement it. But it's almost just easier for people to take. Okay, I'm going to spend a ton of money, but we're going to get this brand new gleaming thing. When in fact, sometimes, and certainly in the case of CRM and Salesforce, usually what you need is actually just to re-implement and improve the implementation that you did. And that's a tougher sell because the problem is the price tag is still really high. I understand a CEO, a board of directors saying, you got to be kidding. Like, why do we need to go spend all this money? Why can't you just band-aid it? Why can't you just tweak it? In my experience, usually nothing big happens until something really breaks. The only time you avoid that is when you have executives who've already had the pain, they've experienced it somewhere else. And then they say, no, let's not wait for it to break because I know what that looks like. Let's deal with it now. But otherwise, generally, something has to be pretty bad for a company to make those kind of investments. At some point, when you've built on top of something and on top of it, on top of it, you end up with a big mess, especially when applications are managed by the business. Sometimes they do it really well, but usually what happens is they've hired, let's say, a Salesforce admin, and the admin just said yes to whatever anyone asked for. So someone said, hey, can you add this field? They said, sure. Hey, can you do this? The problem with that is that you build a kind of a mess, and then now you've got to go clean it up. The cleanup effort is going to be substantial, and the change process is going to be really hard because you've got to figure out how to get from your old messy world into a newer, cleaner world. So look, there are partners. And I think when you find yourself in a situation like that, you really need to find someone who's done this before. Now, some of us have, and so we have some of that ourselves. But even I, having done it some number of times over the course of my career, is not the same as a professional consultant who's done it 20 times in the last 5 years. They've got a level of knowledge and experience that is going to save a lot of trouble because they've already made the mistakes and they have a playbook for how to go after that. Sometimes the vendor can help you, especially at a higher architectural level, depending on the vendor, but sometimes they're a good resource. I do think, though, you've always got to have your own people too. So I feel like sometimes people think they can hand off the whole thing to somebody. And I think the perfect world is a partnership between your own in-house people who really know your business really well and consultants who really know the technology and the software really well and also have been through this change process before. And I think you work together to have success. The most successful projects I've had have been true partnerships in that way.
I think sometimes there's needing to be facts on the table versus emotion. And when you're dealing with teams, especially the founding team or the admin who built the original system, there's going to be a lot of resistance to don't call my baby ugly or don't show that things that were built and have worked are now with problems. And it's difficult to do so internally because there's a lot of politics at play. And I think having a third party come in and basically turn on the lights and say, listen, there is no right and there is no wrong. There's just what is. And here's what needs to be addressed. And you mentioned consulting a second ago. And I'm curious, do you see the consulting world changing with the rise of AI, with boutiques, with the massive consolidation of some of these middle players? And do you think there's an alternative way for help to be provided to the CIOs of today and tomorrow?
In some ways, I don't know. It's interesting. I think AI, in some ways, has less impact on a lot of this kind of work than many others, because I feel like when you start getting into understanding process, driving best practice, which is, I think, what a lot of people are really ultimately asking for, it's a very human effort. And it's in some ways more about change management than it is about technology. It's certainly more about process than it's about technology. So the tools that we've been given, I think, are actually limited. I'm actually very intrigued right now. I'm seeing some early indications of some AI-based tools that I think are really interesting. I'm talking to a company that has a product that will take a description of your process. You can literally go on a Zoom call and walk through it on screen and talk about it and turn it into a requirements document.
Okay.
So I think things like that are really going to help. But at the end of the day, you mentioned politics, and I think people sometimes don't want to talk about that. But the reality is change management is everything. And you're right, you're trying to overcome people's resistance to even acknowledging that there's a problem, or resistance to changing anything, right? Because often the answer is, look, you've got this process, it's built up organically, and to you, that's like the way things need to work. But there's a whole big world out there. And like most people have this much simpler process. And that's actually the core of your solution, is that you actually need to simplify your process. And then we can help you simplify your systems. And then you can get to the nirvana that you're really trying to get to, as opposed to band-aiding things and saying, we have all these custom fields, we're going to go through, okay, but, and by the way, you're going to come back a year from now and you're going to put them all back. So it's like, you've got to do something a little bit more extreme if you really want to solve the problem. In terms of the landscape, my feeling about consultants is always, I want a company that's the right size for me, right? So if I'm a mid-market company and I go to some giant behemoth, I'm a tiny customer for them. And despite all their best intentions, I just don't think I'm going to get the level of intention. And frankly, I'm not necessarily going to get the A team, right? But at the end of the day, consulting is all about the people. So all I really care about are the specific people who are working my project, and I want them to be really good. And by the way, really good doesn't mean good on paper just. They need to be good because they're a good fit for my team and my organization, either because of their vertical experience or their cultural approach. All of those things really matter. So just saying, oh, this person's has tons of experience and they're really smart about Salesforce, that's not enough. But what I really want is someone who's a perfect fit for this specific job. And my experience has been better, to be honest, with smaller companies. And of course, you want to get it just right. If they're too small, then they don't have the resource and things like that. If they're too big, they don't give you enough attention. It's a real Goldilocks situation. You got to find the partners who are just right for you. But I would say I try and take all of those aspects into account.
I think what you shared, I think also the consulting industry, especially the management consulting, is changing significantly, because it used to be time and hours. And I think clients are getting really frustrated, especially knowing what AI can do, to say, I don't need a 25-page report. I need you to help me enable change. I need you to bring those best practices and what you've done previously, and I want to come to the table. And I'm curious if you think this is something that might be appropriate to today's market. We have the done for you model, which is you hire a consultant, you hire a team, they come in and they implement, but their motivation is to stay there forever. That's how they run their business. Is they're never going to leave you to be self-sufficient, because as soon as they're in, they want to stay in. And on the other extreme is a do-it-yourself. It's hiring your own internal team. It's hiring your own internal skill sets. You don't get a lot of outside insight because you foster that person. And so I think there's a place in the middle, which is what I call a done with you model, which is where the partners and people that you'll work with will come to the table with pre-built systems or pre-built approaches that have already worked, and frameworks that are proven and they can adjust by size. But think of them as Lego blocks. Given the problem that you have, we're going to use these 5 blocks, and you can put into these blocks whatever you want. So if you want to implement AI, what model of AI do you want? But you still have to put the AI piece in place. Do you think that's something that CIOs are open to, as far as bringing a different model, a systems as a service approach versus a traditional consulting of done for you or the do it yourself?
I think people are open to that. And I've worked with partners who are starting to move more in that direction. I think that is absolutely a trend, right? A lot more. I think they would describe it as best practice. In the old days, I remember doing projects where consultants would come in and say, the first step is to understand exactly how you do everything today, so that we can figure out how to do that in your new system. And now I think that's been flipped the other way around, where people come in and say, this is the best practice, tell me why it won't work. And unless you can convince me that it won't work, that's what we're doing. If there's a few areas that we say, this really needs a little tweak, or this needs something, then okay, maybe we'll do a few of those, but we're going to really try and limit that. That's what executives want, right? The CFO, when they bring in an ERP system, says, listen, please give me best practice. Just get me out of the box as much as possible. Now, the people down on the closer to the ground are saying, hey, but I have this situation and I have these specific situations that I need to be able to deal with this. I don't think that the people, the practitioners on the ground are crazy to be a little nervous about that approach, right? Because they're afraid that their legitimate concerns are going to get thrown out along maybe with some things that they can give on, right? So again, I think that the human side of this is super important. The change management, that's the whole trick, right? Because you can have the Lego blocks and in theory, from 30,000 feet, you'd be like, this is easy. Just go put the Lego blocks in. But we've all seen projects founder, right? Because that human element wasn't handled properly. And at the end of the day, when someone who's down in the trenches says, hey, boss, can't do what you're asking me to, right? You're asking me to close the books. I can't close the books because these consultants came in and configured things in a way, and I can't do this thing. Trust me, that same executive who said, I just want out of the box and give me best practice is going to be like, do whatever that person says because we got to close the books.
Yeah.
And so suddenly all your best intentions go out the window, right? And so you've really got to fine tune that and get the balance right.
You described in one of our earlier conversations the change from startup to an enterprise, like transitioning from a child to an adult. Can you unpack what operational changes you believe are the most critical during that evolution?
I used to work with someone who hated the term maturity model. I get that, but let's be honest, like that's what it is. It's the maturity model, right? And there's nothing wrong with saying we're a young company. And just like a young person, we're not thinking ahead so much. We're all over the map. We have tons of energy and creativity, right? Versus I'm a little later stage as a company. Now I need to start saying we actually need to focus that in some ways. We can't just do everything at once. We need to be more thoughtful about what we're doing. And we can't be so seat of the pants. We have to actually have some processes because that seat of the pants stuff doesn't scale. If it could scale, then great, but it just doesn't. And so it's time to say, hey, instead of just figuring this out as we go along, let's have a process. So we're all doing the same thing. The other thing is, as any kind of institution or organization of any kind gets bigger, you start having each department, each silo, each group need to interact with each other. And so if they're all just doing their own thing, nothing works. The problem is in real life, processes cross systems and groups and stakeholders. So you've got to start figuring out how to build those muscles around project management, program management, architecture, coordination. That's what CIOs do, right? We're the people who sit in the middle and help make all of this work together. And in the beginning, you don't need that because it's all small and it's all easy. Later, it's big and complicated and there's lots of stakeholders. And so you start to have to take that more seriously. And I think companies in general, as I've seen, are often slow to make that transition. And I get it. People are like, hey, why do I need a PMO? I want to hire salespeople, or I want to hire programmers to write things in Salesforce and actually put new fields in or do things that I can see. But again, anyone who's run anything at scale understands that things like architecture and program management are like how you actually can get there. And that without those things, you can have great intentions, you can work really hard, but it's hard to achieve your results.
So if I can ask a follow-up question to that, how important is documentation when you're going from a startup mentality of just build it and make it work to that phase where now things are starting to break and you're asking people to fix it, but if nothing's ever been written down, how do you balance not enough and too much documentation?
Yeah, this is a tough one, I think, because the thing is we all love documentation and we wish we had more of it. And by the way, this is an area where I think AI, as I was mentioning, can actually really help us. Because I think AI has the ability to do things like just look at your configuration and tell you what it does. Having said that, I think we've also probably all have the experience where we've put a lot of time and energy to create some documentation, but it hasn't been maintained. And you go back just a couple years later and it's almost useless. It's almost worse than nothing because you think you understand what's going on, but it's not actually up to date. And so it fools you into thinking you know what's going on when you don't actually. So one thing about documentation is that I never want to document something unless there's a plan for keeping that document maintained. Unless it's a pure like one-time thing and we're just doing this project and we need that, right? But for the most part, I don't want to spend resource, time, energy on documenting something. If it's important enough to document, it's important enough to keep it maintained. And I think that's actually a good test too, because I think when you ask that, you might say, maybe this documentation isn't as important. But what if we have to prioritize? Like saying this is important enough that we should keep it up to date is a good way of knowing which things should be at the top of that list. It's so funny when you go to meet with a business group and talk about their process and they say, we've got these problems. And you say, okay, so tell me how you do it today. How often nobody can tell you the answer to that. And to the extent that they can tell you the answer, they can tell you their piece of the process, which is, again, it's critically important to understand how everybody's piece ties together. And as IT professionals, we've seen this a million times. You go talk to 3 groups, they're each like, my thing works. And they're right, their thing works for them. But the whole process end to end is massively broken. And they're all pointing fingers at each other, saying, if they could just fix this thing upstream, all my problems would be done. But actually, the solution is going to require all 3 of those groups to make changes together in concert. And that's the only way you're really going to solve the true problem. And that's where that documentation starts becoming really important, because you can't even get started if you can't say what's even happening today.
And I think there's some approaches that are coming into the market right now, and there's what is called process mining, which is where you take a look at how users are actually working through the system. And with Salesforce, you can use metadata to really understand what that process looks like. And then you have something called process configuration mapping, which instead of it being a heat map is more of an architectural blueprint where you know where all the stop signs and where all the cross sections and where the wiring is. And I think when those two are combined, it's incredibly powerful, because you're coming to the leadership or even to business saying, here's where we are today. And if they're living, breathing documents, meaning when the changes are made, it's done in real time, is going to open up a lot of conversations of what's possible and what's not possible. And I think when a CIO or an executive is able to come to the table and say, I hear you, yes, we want to do it, but here's all the implications, or here's all the knock-on effects that we're going to have. You can help me decide if we want to invest over time to address these, or if you want to go in a different direction. Bring that statement of fact almost to the table will alleviate a lot of emotion, because you're looking at the same thing. It's like looking at an architectural diagram from building a house. Yes, you want to remove that wall, but that's a load-bearing wall. And yes, we can do it, but we're going to have to reposition how this roof is being held up. So you let me know what you want to do.
I feel the same way. I think part of my approach to being CIO probably comes from the fact that I started from a services background. But my feeling is the answer is never no. The answer is, first of all, tell me what you're trying to accomplish. Don't tell me what to do. Tell me what you're trying to accomplish. And what I'll give you are options. And I'll give you pros and cons. Because there's no magic one, there's no perfect answer. This will do these things, but it'll be super expensive and take a long time. And I think my job is to give the right information in a consumable way to executives who can then make a business decision. But one of the things that I talk about with people sometimes is that we think sometimes we're making a technology decision. When you're on the ground and you're in a group, maybe you're in the security team and you're like, we want to buy this piece of software because it's going to help us solve the security problem. The accounting team wants to buy something because it's going to solve this accounting problem. And so they've got a scorecard and they've looked at a bunch of vendors and they've come up with something, right? But when that bubbles up to the CFO, to the CEO, to the board, right? They're not solving a security problem or an accounting problem. They're making an investment decision. And that's a different process. And their scorecard is different than your scorecard. And the fact that you've got a perfect answer to solve a very legitimate problem, that's fine. But that's one of 100 things that are on their list from every department in the company. And every department is saying, this is vital to this company that we go solve this, but they can only afford to fund 10. So they've got a tough set of decisions to make. You want to take the emotion out of it, right? Because again, down on the ground, people are like, don't you think this is a big problem? Why don't you think it's a problem? Why wouldn't you solve this? But the question is not, is it a big problem or not? Take that emotion out of it for a second. The question is, where does the company invest? And sometimes that's going to go the way you want, and sometimes it's not. And I know it's tough when it doesn't go the way you want. You're like, these people are crazy. Hey, why don't they understand how important my thing is? But I think it's important to understand the view from their side of things. And by the way, if you want to try and sell that project internally or move it forward, you've got to be able to speak that language, right? And talk about that. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to go to my CEO and say, listen, we have a big problem over here, and here's the answer. I'm going to say, let me put a couple of options in front of you. Let me explain it to you in English. And by the way, let me explain it to you in English with an eye toward the fact that you are making an investment decision, right? And I think that's my job, is to enable those leaders to make good business decisions. So yeah, 100%. That's a huge part of this whole job that we're all engaged in, which I think boils down to trying to make our companies run better. I've never met someone in IT who didn't fundamentally have the motivation that they wanted to make things better. In fact, a common attribute of people in our line of work is that it drives them crazy when things aren't optimized. They almost can't stand it. They're like, I want to fix that. I can't stand the fact that process is broken or that the system is clunky. But it's good to also have that perspective that there's a lot going on in the company. Everybody's got problems, and somebody somewhere's got to always make some tough decisions.
As companies scale, governance often lags behind. How can CIOs set up governance frameworks and grow with the business and staffing without stifling innovation? What are your thoughts?
It's hugely important. It's changed so much since I got into this business. He used to really be in charge of things much more than they are now. And we really saw a whole series of things, everything from microcomputers that allowed people to run things on their desk to the cloud, and now AI, which is just the latest version of this. All of those things democratize technology. They enable business people to actually go create solutions for themselves, which is awesome. And we've exploded the value that people can get from these technologies by unleashing it from having to, everything has to go through the IT department. However, we do have these little security issues and cost issues. We have an explosion of SaaS applications in most companies. I don't think there's any company of any size that you go to where you won't find duplicate technologies. And so I think you put it exactly the right way. How do you find the balance? Because I don't want to stifle innovation. AI was a great example of that, right? There were legitimate security concerns when this came out. I think a lot of those, by the way, have been addressed. And sometimes people are continuing to be a little bit more worried about that than they necessarily need to be. But certainly in the beginning, like especially, there was legitimate concerns, but also clearly we got to get our hands on this stuff. We got to be using it. There's no way that we're going to be competitive if we just put our head in the sand and say that AI stuff is just a fad, it's going away. No, trust me, this is big. The approach that I've always taken, and even when I first got to Gainsight, I remember doing a blog post about IT as a facilitator more than a dictator, frankly. How do we play that role of facilitation, coordination, governance, architecture, but not actually have to necessarily own every single resource and every single application? And I think that's entirely possible, but it requires a little different mindset. It requires some openness on both sides, to be honest. I think those business groups that say, no, I have to do this all myself, have to be willing to give a little bit. I think IT has to be willing to give a little bit. We can meet in the middle and say, look, can we jointly come together and have a council that manages this application or this function? And I think those kind of models they're not just the future of IT, they're the present. And I think people who aren't taking advantage of those kind of structures are missing out.
So just to wrap things up, if you could offer one piece of advice to mid-market CIO who's about to scale their company dramatically, what would it be?
I think the biggest piece of advice that I generally give people is to at least virtually get out of your office And I had someone years ago give me that advice back in the old days when we had actual offices and cubes. And it was very good advice. So understand that change management is the biggest part of what you're doing, and that you've got to have great relationships and partnerships across the business to actually get anywhere. So it's important to, I think for me personally, what comes naturally is spending a lot of time with my team. What doesn't always come as naturally is to go out and reach out to people on the business side, and not just when there's a crisis or they're asking me for something or I'm asking them for something, but to just have a Zoom call and catch up, or if you can, have coffee or lunch and really try and understand the world from their point of view. There's a real tendency to dismiss other people's viewpoints sometimes because, for instance, we might say, look, there's a best practice. Why can't you just do that? And they say, it's too hard. And we're skeptical of that. I'm pretty sure you probably could do it, right? But if you were to do something like, as a business analyst, I used to do chair sides, right? Where you sit with someone and you actually watch exactly what they do. And you literally walk a mile in their shoes. You sit a day in their cube, right? And you really understand what their world is. It totally transforms your understanding. And I think as we move into bigger and bigger roles, sometimes we lose some of that. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to drive change. It's very hard to drive transformation if you don't really understand the concerns and the reality on the ground for people. And so the more time you spend doing that, the better everything else will go. And so I think that's generic advice, but I think especially as companies are at an inflection point, they're getting ready to make that move, let's say, from a smaller company to a bigger company, from simpler processes to more complex processes, building some relationships and trust with people, especially if you are, like a lot of CIOs, coming at this with experience, right? I've done this before. I've seen what this looks like at scale. In a way, that's a good thing. It's not, I'm here to lecture you or make you do something, but I'm here to help you. I'm here to be your true partner. I think everything else in some ways takes care of itself. If you have the right alignment and the right relationships, then you can work through things. It doesn't mean it'll all be easy, but when you have problems, when you have issues, you can come together. You trust each other enough to put things out on the table and say, okay, what's the business decision we're going to make that works for everybody? It's amazing when you reach out and you structure things in a good way, things can work sometimes better than you think, but you've got to make the effort. You've got to make a conscious effort to get out of your cube, get in a room with people, and really build those bridges that are going to help carry you over. I like your metaphor, the chasm that you've got to get over, right? Yeah. You've got to go build a bridge to do that. And everybody's got to be on the same page, and you've got to be able to work together as a team.
Karl, those are incredible insights. And I just want to thank you once again for putting up with the technology glitch and for sticking around and for joining today on the Heartbeat podcast, and really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, fun conversation. Thanks.